Happy Monday! I had an interesting thought before I get started on reading the book. I was thinking, I'm going to leave these up when we're done with all this. And I thought how interesting it'll be if these are up years from now and people are watching this who didn't experience this quarantine. And I wonder what they will notice about these videos, and how I talk to you guys. And I was wondering, what do you think you'll remember? When you get to be my age and you're talking to people your age and they ask you about it, what will you say? What stands out to you in your memory? Were the memories good? Were they bad? How did you feel? I think that's going to be really interesting. And I hope that in spite of the circumstances, it's a good story. I hope that things have gone well for you in the middle of this unpleasantness. We took a little bit of a break there because you guys were saying that you were having a little trouble keeping up with all of the videos in my never-ceasing experimentation. This week I plan to do 5 videos, but you have a little less work to go with it. So I might do this where I'm sort of like an on week and an off week, or maybe less videos one week. I just don't want to overwhelm you. That's my goal. I want you to have work to work on, but not so much work that you feel like you're drowning. So that's the goal. But we are right in the middle of a very exciting part of this book, and I did leave you on a cliffhanger for a whole week. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with Chapter 17, Typhoon. Ooh, one more thing. I'm sorry. I know I said I would get started. This week there is a set of questions. They're posted to Classroom. There's about 5 questions. Again, this one is one where it'll say 7th grade or 8th grade. If just one grade is supposed to answer that question. If not, just answer the question. And then everybody is supposed to do an IXL as well. Okay? Alright. Chapter 17, Typhoon. When we last left Louis Zamperini, he was trapped on a raft floating in the ocean. And it says, I'll read you the last paragraph again. It says, to the west, something appeared, so distant it could only be glimpsed from the tops of the swells. The moment the sea tossed them up and their eyes grasped it, Phil and Louis knew what it was. It was an island. Chapter 17, Typhoon. All day, under a gyrating sky, Louis and Phil rode the swells, feeling a weary thrill as the island peeked into view. Slowly, it became distinct. They saw a bright white line where waves dashed against a beach or reef. That afternoon, one island became 2, then many. Overhead, a colossal storm was gathering. The men rowed landward. The sky broke. A slashing rain came down, and the winds vanished. The ocean began heaving and thrashing. The wind sent the raft spinning up swells, perhaps 40 feet, then careening down into troughs as deep as canyons. Phil and Louis were in a typhoon. Wave after wave slammed into the raft, tipping it sideways and peeling it upward. To stop it from flipping, Louis and Phil bailed in water to weigh it down, sat on opposite sides to balance their weight, and laid down to keep the center of gravity low. They held on. Night fell and the storm pounded. The raft raced over hundreds of mountains of water. At times, the men felt themselves flying in the darkness as the raft was swept up in the air. Louis felt even more intensely afraid than he'd felt as the Green Hornet was falling. They thought of the land they could no longer see, fearing that any second they'd be flung into a reef. Can you imagine how scary that would be to be so close, and then to be worried that the very thing that you've been hoping to see forever would be the thing that would kill you? It's terrible. Sometime in the night, the storm died away. In the wake came the sweetest scent, soil, greenness, rain washing over living things, the scent of land. As dawn neared, the men heard the hiss of water scouring a reef. Exhausted, they took turns napping, with one man on the lookout for land. Somewhere along the way, they both fell asleep. They woke in a new universe. After weeks in open ocean, they were surrounded by islands. On one, they saw a deserted native village. They'd heard of the Japanese capturing and shipping out natives as slaves and wondered if that had happened here. They began rowing for shore. Louis had predicted they'd find land on the 47th day. Phil had chosen 46th. Because they'd spotted land on the 46th and were reaching it on the 47th, they decided they'd both been right. Louis gazed at a tiny island with one tree on it. A strange thing had happened. A strange thing happened. The tree became two trees. After a moment's confusion, he suddenly understood. It wasn't an island. And those weren't trees. It was a boat. It had been perpendicular to them, leaving only one mast visible, and then it turned, bringing the rearward mast into view. Louis and Phil ducked and rowed as fast as they could, trying to get ashore before they were spotted. They were too late. The boat sped towards them. Louis and Phil rowed hard, but the boat caught them and drew alongside the raft. Along the deck stood a line of Japanese men, aiming guns at Louis and Phil. A sailor threw a rope, and Louis caught it. He and Phil tried to climb up to the boat, but their legs were too weak. The sailors tied them to a rope ladder and dragged them up. On the deck, Louis and Phil tried to rise, but their legs buckled. With the sailors hurting them, they crawled to the mast. The sailors lashed them to it and bound their hands behind them. A sailor spoke to them in Japanese, apparently asking questions. Another waved a bayonet past Louis's face, trying to hack off his beard. One cracked a pistol into Phil's jaw, then moved to do the same to Louis. Louis tipped his head forward then. When the sailor swung, jerked his head back. He made the man miss, but smacked his head against the mast. The captain approached and chastised the crewmen. The mood changed. Louis and Phil's hands were untied, and they were given water and 2 biscuits. Louis ate slowly, savoring each crumb. It was his first food in 8 days. Louis and Phil were transferred to a second boat, where a crewman fed them more biscuits and some coconut. A man approached, Japanese-English dictionary in hand, and asked questions. Phil and Louis told of their journey. The boat drew up to an island. Louis and Phil were blindfolded, and men half carried them off the boat. After a few minutes, Louis felt himself being laid down on something soft. His blindfold was removed. He and Phil were in an infirmary, lying on beds. Through a window, he saw Japanese soldiers thrusting bayonets into dummies. An officer spoke to the Japanese surrounding the castaways, then spoke in English, apparently repeating himself so Louis and Phil would understand. "These are American flyers," he said. "Treat them gently." A doctor came in, smiled, examined Phil and Louis, and smoothed ointment on their salt sores. Louis and Phil took turns standing on a scale, each with a man ready to catch him if his legs failed. Phil, who'd weighed about 150 pounds when he'd stepped aboard Green Hornet, now weighed about 80 pounds. Now, I don't remember how tall they said Phil was. We could probably flip back and look, but assuming he's average height for a man, good gosh and gravy. Okay, because Phil doesn't weigh a whole lot more than I do. And imagine what would happen to me if I lost that much weight. Okay, so said 150 pounds. So he lost 70 pounds, if I'm doing the math right. It's a wonder he could even stand at all. By different accounts, 5'10" Louis, who'd weighed about 160 pounds before the crash, weighed 65 pounds, 79.5 pounds, or 87 pounds. Either way, bad, right? The doctor had cognac, eggs, ham, milk, fresh bread, and fruit salad brought in. Louis and Phil feasted. When they were done, they were seated before Japanese officers, who gaped at the shrunken, yellow men. An officer asked how they'd ended up here. Louis told the story as the officers listened, fascinated. Louis and Phil knew where their journey had begun, but they didn't know where it had ended. The officers told them. They were in the Marshall Islands. They drifted 2,000 miles. 2 beds were made up, and the castaways were invited to rest. Slipping between cool, clean sheets, their stomachs full, their sores soothed, they were deeply grateful. Phil had a relieved thought. They are our friends. Louis and Phil stayed in the infirmary for 2 more days, attended by kind Japanese. On the 3rd day, an officer came, bearing beef, chocolate, coconuts, and news. They were being taken to another atoll. The name he gave sent a tremor through Louis. Kwajalein. It was the place known as Execution Island. After you leave here, the officer said, we cannot guarantee your life. Aboard the freighter, Louis and Phil were treated well. But as they drew up to Kwajalein, the Japanese suddenly became harsh. On came the blindfolds, and Louis and Phil were carried ashore and dumped on a hard surface. When Louis said something to Phil, a boot kicked him as a voice shouted, no! An engine started, and they were moving. They were on a truck. In a few minutes, the truck stopped, and Louis was tugged out and carried again. There was walking, a darkening, and the feeling of being thrown backwards. Louis's back struck a wall, and he fell to the floor. Someone yanked off his blindfold. A door slammed. A lock turned. At first, Louis could barely see. His eyes darted about uncontrollably. His mind raced, flitting wildly from thought to thought. After weeks of endless openness, he was disoriented by the compression of space around him. Slowly, his thoughts quieted and his eyes settled. He was in a cell, about the length of his body and a little wider than his shoulders. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know if you caught that. He was in a cell about the length of his body, so he's, the past page said he was 5'10", and a little bit wider than his shoulders. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a little bit claustrophobic, and the thought of being in a room that small and being stuck there. There was a small window in the door. The floor was strewn with gravel, dirt, and maggots, and the room hummed with flies and mosquitoes already swarming on him. There was a hole in the floor with a latrine bucket below it. The air hung scorching hot and still, heavy with the stench of human waste. Louis looked up. In the dimness, he saw words carved in the wall. 9 Marines marooned on Macon Island, August 12, 1942. Below were 9 names. In August 1942, after an American raid on a Japanese base at Macon in the Marshall Islands, 9 Marines had been mistakenly left behind. Captured by the Japanese, they'd disappeared. Louis was almost certainly the first American to learn they'd been taken to Kwajalein, but they weren't here now. Louis felt a wave of foreboding. He called to Phil. Phil's voice answered, distant and small. He was down the hall in a squalid hole just like Louis's. Each asked the other if he was okay. They knew it was likely the last time they'd talk, but if they wished to say goodbye, neither had the chance. There was shuffling in the corridor as a guard took up his station. Louis and Phil went quiet. Louis looked down at his body. Legs that had sprung through a 4-minute, 12-second mile on that last Hawaiian morning were now useless. His vibrant body had shrunken until only the bones remained, draped in yellow skin, crawling with parasites. All I see, he thought, is a dead body breathing. He dissolved into hard, racking weeping. He muffled his sobs so the guard wouldn't hear him. That's the end of this chapter. And the end of part 3. Coming up is part 4. See you in the next video. Aren't you glad we didn't stop there, huh?